From their vantage point on the peak, the 7 IRA men were able to identify the islands of Clew Bay, which gave the impression of being clustered together when seen from such a great height. Below them, glistening in the reflected light, was the whole history of the district. Some of them could supply memorised fragments, which, in a folklore territory, went back to medieval times. On Monday, the 23rd of May 1921, a few days after the Kilmena ambush, a section of the West Mayo flying column found themselves surrounded by British forces on this mountain, deep in the Nathan Beg range. The West Mayo flying column were an elite active service unit of the IRA, supported by local volunteers and Cumann. This was their homeland, and they were at war with the British Empire to attain its independence. The next few months would determine the future of the fledgling Irish Republic.
Et donner la liberté à ce peuple opprimé. Vive la nation! Vive la nation!
In Mayo, the history of the 1798 rebellion and the memories it embedded in the people's perception of their relationship to authority and to British rule added to the Republican desire for an independent Ireland. The assertion of Irishness that began in the late 19th century had its roots in movements like the Young Irelanders, Fenianism, and those who fled the famine to America and who held on to songs and stories of their homeland. These were retransmitted to Ireland in the late 19th century. In 1893, Conradh na Gaeilge, the Irish language movement, contributed a sense of identity to those who wished to invoke their separate Irishness. Indeed, Owen MacNeill, a founder member, was also to be the leader of the Irish Volunteers. Many of the 1916 revolutionaries were members of Conradh na Gaeilge and the GAA and other such organisations. The Abbey Theatre was founded in 1904 to promote Irish drama. Yeats, Synge, O'Casey and others availed of this opportunity. And so the rapid social and cultural changes of the late 19th century inspired the people to an awareness of their separate Irish identity. On the political front, the Irish Parliamentary Party had split as a result of the Parnell scandal. Some supported the Home Rule Party leader, while others took a more conservative view. 1905 saw the formation of another small party, Sinn Féin. They would be denied electoral success till the 1918 election, but from there on would play a major role. Many held them responsible for the 1916 Rising, though as an organisation they had not taken part. However, by 1917 they had 112,000 members. John Redmond appealed to the Irish Volunteers to support the war effort in return for Home Rule, The volunteers split into the Redmondite National Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers, who followed Owen MacNeill and who refused to support the war effort.
I have a distinct recollection of this period, 1915 I think, of a very large recruiting meeting in Westport, the speakers at which delivered their orations from the balcony of the town hall. Although they had Michael O'Leary, VC from Cork, to ginger things up, and a number of tables ready to take names for recruits after the meeting was over, they did not get one recruit in Westport as a result of this meeting.
There was one organisation that remained quietly in the background, the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, also known as the Fenian Brotherhood and in America as Clan na Gael. They were a secret, oath-bound society dedicated to the establishing of an independent, democratic Irish Republic. Michael Moran of Callobrack became a member of the Volunteers in 1913, and they held their meetings in the Father Manna Sweeney Memorial Hall in Newport. It was here that the hall was situated, close to the grotto, and Michael Moore noticed that after meetings some men would remain on. These were IRB men planning to hold their own secret meeting. And later, in conversation, Michael Kilroy asked Moran if he would like to join the IRB if they existed. The Newport Volunteers under Michael Kilroy used his home and workshop at Carabon as their headquarters. During Easter week of 1916, there were 4 volunteers constantly on duty there. Their military equipment was sparse enough: a service rifle, a few revolvers and some shotguns. There was also explosives and a few pikes. And most importantly, there was metal cutting equipment. This is the site of the former railway station at Newport. Michael Kilroy proposed to armour plate a car using metal from one of the bridges here. It was then his strategy to lead a motorised column to Athlone and to destroy the bridge across the Shannon. In July 1914, 900 Mauser rifles were landed in Hope by Erskine Childers from his yacht, the Asgard. Some of those rifles found their way to Mayo. The volunteers had other plans to procure additional weapons.
We made a survey of the district for arms, and we decided that, as there were several British soldiers at home on leave from the war carrying rifles, we would relieve them of these before they returned. We raided all their homes with fairly good success.
As a result of their marching and drilling, the volunteers came to the attention of the RIC, who followed known volunteer members wherever they went. Yet many RIC men were sympathetic to the volunteers and voluntarily gave information when raids were about to happen. Indeed, many of those RIC men had resigned from the force before the conflict began in earnest. There were 6 RIC men and an inspector in the Newport barracks. It would be one of the targets for the Newport Battalion during the planned Easter Rebellion. On Good Friday of Easter week, Michael Kilroy took Michael Moran to a house south of Westport, where an IRB meeting was taking place. Joseph McBride, brother of Major John, the revolutionary, was chairman, and those present were required to take an oath of allegiance to the Republic. At that meeting, they were informed that there were to be 3 days of manoeuvres and that action was about to start.
I had met McBride on Easter Saturday evening and remarked to him that I hoped we should have a good parade tomorrow, Sunday. And he replied that he thought there should be nothing doing. It was only afterwards I realised the significance of his reply. The Sunday papers contained McNeill's countermanding order.
Volunteers completely deceived. All orders for tomorrow Sunday are completely cancelled. Thus wrote Owen McNeill to countermand the planned rising. The Irish volunteers had been planning to hold peaceful manoeuvres, but on Easter Saturday, McNeill discovered that a group within the organisation, led by Padraig Pearse, had secret plans to launch an armed rebellion. Furthermore, on learning of the arrest of Roger Casement and the loss of the promised German arms, McNeill was against any rising, believing it to be doomed to failure. This came as a tremendous shock to the Newport volunteers. Kilroy had no choice but to dismiss the men, but he did ask them to be prepared to get to their appointed places on receipt of the order to do so. The order never came. The rising began in Dublin on Easter Monday, 24th of April 1916, and lasted for 6 days. On that Easter Monday morning, it was 21-year-old Michael Staines from Kiltarnet, Newport, County Mayo, who raised the tricolour over the GPO. As he looked down into Sackville Street, he could see and hear Padraig Pearse read the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the Irish Republic. Risings were planned for many parts of the country. In Galway, for instance, Liam Mellows was to lead the rebellion, but it was never clear what they were supposed to do, and so their efforts came to naught, and they dispersed and went on the run at the end of Easter week. "15 of the revolutionaries, including all 7 signatories of the proclamation, were executed at Kilmainham Jail by firing squad between the 3rd and the 12th of May, while lesser participants were interned in various parts of Britain. As W.B. Yeats the poet put it in words forever to be remembered, a terrible beauty is born." With the rising crushed and the leaders executed, Britain could now concentrate on the war effort in Europe. There were already some 200,000 Irishmen fighting for the English cause. Some were there to earn money to feed their families, while others were there for the adventure and the glory, and still others supported John Redmond. By 1918, the British were desperate for reinforcements. The government introduced and passed a conscription bill for Ireland in April of 1918. This brought immediate and universal agreement amongst all those opposed to conscription. In Mayo, 700 volunteers and 150 Cumann made a pilgrimage to the Reek in protest. The Catholic Church also opposed the law. It was never enforced, but it did increase the numbers joining the volunteers. This is Glendahurk in the foothills of the Nathans Mountains, right behind me. And it was here that plans were made to conceal young volunteers, should the British military attempt to search for them, in order to enforce conscription. Despite all the protests and actions, it mattered little. The Great War was to end just 6 months later. As a result of the failed Easter Rising, there were over 3,000 men and 100 women interned in Frongach and other English prisons. And while there, they got to know each other and where they came from, and they also trained in revolutionary methods and organisation. The time was fast approaching when this revolutionary elite, schooled in these prison camps, would take up arms in the next phase of the struggle for independence. By December 1916, most of the prisoners were released from internment. Many of them were members of Sinn Féin. They immediately began to politicise the struggle for independence. It soon became clear that Sinn Féin were positioning themselves to establish an independent Irish Republic. In early 1918, Richard Mulcahy was appointed Chief of Staff of the IRA, and Eamon de Valera President of the Volunteers. For their part, the British established a royal commission that pointed up the failings of the Irish administration, but did nothing to change it. In fact, Ireland was discussed only once at the weekly cabinet meetings between June 1917 and March 1918. And all the while, young IRA men, with the support of Cumann Mon, were preparing for a new confrontation with the British establishment and its military in Ireland. Lloyd George now sought to benefit from the armistice in Europe by calling a general election in December 1918. But he did not take into account the situation in Ireland. Sinn Féin swept the boards with 69 out of 105 seats. They immediately refused to attend Westminster, instead forming their own parliament, the first Dáil, in the Mansion House in Dublin. This was the beginning of the Sinn Féin abstentionist policy. The Volunteers swore an oath of allegiance to the Dáil, thus becoming Óglaigh na hÉireann, the Irish Republican Army in the service of the new Dáil. The oath was administered in Mayo by different people, such as Richard Mulcahy, who came from Dublin on one occasion, and in a small hall 3 miles from Westport he administered the oath of allegiance to the West Mayo Brigade. A line was drawn on the floor and volunteers were asked to cross the line, and by doing so indicating that there was no going back. One volunteer recalled the oath being sworn not on a Bible but on prayer books.
I, Tom Kittrick, do solemnly swear that I will not yield voluntary support to any pretended government, authority or power within Ireland.
And I do further swear that I will support and defend the Irish Republic and all Ireland against all enemies,
and I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
And that I will take this obligation freely without any reservations, so help me God.
The scene was now set for a war that would begin slowly but would gather momentum. As a result of IRA activities in 1920, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, assented to martial law of the most stringent kind, and also to counter-terrorism measures. In effect, the British state let loose a reign of terror on the people of Ireland. Major General Hugh Tudor would unleash the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. The British government had cried havoc and let slip the dogs of war. This policy was forcefully implemented when Lieutenant Colonel Smith spoke to the garrison in Listowel in June 1920.
If a police barracks is burnt, then the best house in the locality is to be commandeered. The occupants thrown into the gutter. Let them lie there. The more the merrier. Police are to lie in ambush, and when civilians are seen approaching, shout, "Hands up!" Should that order not be obeyed at once, shoot, and shoot to kill. If a person approaching is in any way suspicious looking, shoot them down. You may make mistakes occasionally, that can't be helped. You're bound to get the right person sometime.
Mayo would suffer greatly from that state-sponsored terrorism, but equally would produce leaders and activists who would carry the war back to the RIC and the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans. And Michael Kilroy would be in the front rank of those leaders. Michael Kilroy was born in Derrylahan townland near Newport. He moved to his grandparents' house in Cloneshel, and from there he attended Coolmore National School, where he was taught by Martin Casey. Casey had a major influence on the young Kilroy, imbuing him with a sense of Irishness and a love of its history. Michael became a carpenter and coach builder and set up his own business in Newport. In January 1921, he took command of the West Mayo Brigade of the IRA. He was a strict commander and a quick learner, as shown in the aftermath of the Kilmina ambush. After the Civil War, he entered politics, eventually becoming a TD. He died in 1962. In Mayo, another issue had become significant. The land war was not over. A new land agitation was being experienced in the county. From the early 1900s on, there was a view that the Land Acts favoured the richer tenants and led to large commercial holdings. The poorer tenants, it was felt, did not benefit from the reorganisation of holdings. There were many cattle drives in Mayo during 1917, when, usually at night, groups of men, Irish volunteers for the most part, would drive cattle from their fields, often leaving them to wander the roads and boreens, or indeed to drive them farther afield and sell them on. By the summer of 1920, the shadow Sinn Féin government had established the Irish Republican courts. They operated alongside the English court system. They were very successful, especially here in Mayo, in the area of land and cattle drives. They strove to apply justice in the light of the 1916 proclamation, and the underdog wasn't always successful. The emergence of people like Conor Maguire, who was first elected to Mayo County Council in 1899, these lawyers, councillors and judges would slowly assume the powers of the English court system. By July 1920, the conventional court system had collapsed, with no cases coming before them. Conor Maguire was later to state, "It is not easy to understand how we were allowed to get away with it. These Republican courts did far more damage to the prestige of the English government than any assassination ever did." There were arrests and court appearances and refusals to recognise the British administered courts. The tensions were growing. The assassination, or murder, whichever your point of view, of R.M. Milling in late March 1919 was never attributed to anyone, though there were many suspects. Some claim that it was Michael Collins himself who ordered the execution. It did, however, have an effect. For some volunteers, there were lighter sentences, and for others, the court cases had to be transferred to Galway for trial. As the Sinn Féin grip on the county tightened, so too did the actions of the volunteers become more open and evident. For instance, on fair days and holidays, the volunteers would provide patrols of two to ensure that brawls or fistfights were stopped before the RIC could intervene. The volunteers carried police whistles so that they could call for help if needed. Bit by bit, public opinion was turning in favour of the volunteers and their intentions. In early 1920, the Mayo Brigade was divided into 17 battalions, based on the major towns, led by a commandant, and each having 4 to 8 companies of 103 men. The company was to be the main tactical unit of the IRA. The West Mayo Brigade consisted of 4 battalions, and our story is concerned with the 2nd Battalion and the Active Service Unit, also known as the West Mayo Flying Column. The flying column was drawn from all 4 battalion areas. These 65 men were the best armed, most capable and most active, and they were empowered to engage the enemy throughout the entire brigade area. In 1920, Pather McMahon came down to Mayo to offer additional training to the brigade. New tactics were adopted. The coming war would not be fought face to face, but on the terms of the IRA, by night and by ambush, for the most part. After every engagement, the volunteers would melt away into the countryside to safe houses, to rest and recuperate for the next action. McMahon's efforts were aided by some ex-British Army men returned from the Great War, their knowledge and experience invaluable to the volunteers. Another group who would play a vital role in the coming conflict were Cumann na mBan. They were formed in 1914. Sadly, the new Free State would airbrush many of them from the record, and it was not until the 21st century that they obtained the recognition they richly deserved. The case of Dr. Kathleen Lynn is a good example. She was born near Killala in County Mayo. She was a suffragette, a Labour activist, a member of the Irish Citizen Army, and during the 1916 Rising, she was the chief medical officer. After the Rising, she was imprisoned. In later years, her career went on to great success when, with Dr. Noel Brown, she would be instrumental in setting up St. Ultan's Hospital for Infants in Dublin. There were many unsung heroic women in Mayo. There were branches in Glenhest, Brocka, Kilmena, Shamor and Tirnar, as well as Westport and Castlebar. This was repeated all over Mayo. Cumann na mBan promoted symbols as part of the national struggle. Flags and banners were popular during the 1798 rebellion and the Fenian Rising of 1867. In 1848, the tricolour was brought from France to Ireland by the Young Irelanders. The 1916 rebellion and the raising of the tricolour made that flag an important symbol once again. The Tirnar banner is a great example. Commissioned by the local volunteers and Cumann na mBan, the banner made its first appearance in 1917. One side depicts Padraig Pearse, while St. Patrick is featured on the other. These flags and banners were usually paraded on feast days, such as St. Patrick's Day and again at Easter. They had a huge effect on people, instilling a sense of their heritage and identity. For this reason, the authorities feared them and made every effort to confiscate and destroy them. Raids were carried out in local communities, but the custodians of the banner were always one step ahead to thwart their efforts. Cumann na mBan would be the backbone of the coming war. They would carry messages, tend the wounded, comfort the injured, and hide the arms. They would be the unsung heroines of the War of Independence, always alert to the possibility of danger, suffering humiliations at the hands of Black and Tans, having their homes wrecked and burned, and finally, in the New Ireland, forgotten and removed from recognition. By 1920, incidents were occurring in various parts of the county, such as the raid on the income tax office at Claremorris. Skirmishes also occurred at other places, such as Clogher, or here at the Red Bridge on Altamont Street in Westport. The West Mayo volunteers were anxious to engage with the enemy. The first fatal engagement with the enemy occurred by chance rather than by design. On March the 22nd, 1921, Michael Kilroy, Joe Ring and Brodie Malone were confronted by a sergeant and 3 constables as they walked a quiet boreen just off the Westport Road near Carrow Kennedy. Shooting began immediately with Peter the Painter's, used by the Flying Column men. These were Mauser revolvers. Only 9 feet, the width of the road, separated the combatants. Those with the most desire to live would be successful. The fight ended well for the volunteers. Michael Kilroy wounded the sergeant, a man called Coughlin, and he died later. Michael himself stated that I regretted this very deeply afterwards. It was the townspeople of Westport and surrounding districts that paid a heavy price as the forces of law and order went on a rampage of burnings and beatings. Retribution was inflicted not on the IRA men, but on their families and the communities that they came from. Again and again, the Black and Tans sought to drive a wedge between the volunteers and those communities. Some villages stand out for their support of the West Mayo Brigade. Ahagour is one of them, as was the area around Aughty and Drummond. Tirnar stands out as a district that gave great support, as well as many young men, to the flying column. Brocka was another. Shermore and Skirda was a strategic location in the heart of the Navan Mountains where families sheltered many a volunteer. Eventually, the Black and Tans were forced to withdraw to barracks, confined to sally forth to patrol the major roads and to harass the people of the countryside. On the 3rd of May, the first major ambush in Mayo took place in Tourmakeedy, under the leadership of Commandant Tom Maguire. The South Mayo volunteers succeeded in killing a number of RIC, as well as Black and Tans and military. Maguire himself was wounded, but managed to escape, despite major troop searches of the Partry Mountains. This monument was erected to the memory of IRA volunteer Pádraig Feehan. He had travelled from Ballinrobe to join Tom Maguire. He was arrested by the Black and Tans and shot on this hillside, execution style. The Tourmakeedy ambush must have given great impetus to the West Mayo flying column. However, on Friday the 6th of May 1921, 2 young Island 80 men lost their lives to the Black and Tans while they were preparing an ambush here at the Big Wall. Their names were Tomás O'Malley and Tomás Lally. As a result of the increasing ambushes and activities of the volunteers, the Black and Tans began to escalate their own war of terror on an unsuspecting population. On the 12th of May, Petey Joe MacDonald and Jack Feehan arrived outside Westport. They were on their way to Feehan's house in Rossau. There, they were going to the wedding of Petey Joe MacDonald to Tilly Kilroy, Michael Kilroy's sister. They were witness to a trail of destruction left by the RIC and the Black and Tans. And this is what Feehan wrote in his witness statement. On the 12th of May, we arrived outside Westport. We continued on to Newport, and on our way we called at Stephen McGough's house, and there, to our horror, found him sitting in the midst of his ruined house. Everything was smashed and broken. Seemingly, a gang of RIC under District Inspector Fudge and Sergeant Butler had raided the house just before we arrived. They brought a cow into the kitchen and put Michael on its back, whipped her round the kitchen and out the front door, with Michael still on her back and shots ringing out after him. We made haste after them, and as we were well armed with grenades and small arms, we would give them something to think about if we caught up with them. We came to Tom Lyon's house. When Petey Joe MacDonald and Jack Feehan arrived here at Tom Lyon's house, they found the same thing had happened. The RIC men had beaten this man as he lay in bed with rifle butts, and then brought a horse into the bedroom and beat the horse until he reared up and struck Lyons with his hooves. Tom Lyons never fully recovered from this. We only missed them by the smallest bit, and our tempers were so bad that we were considering following them into Newport. 5 members were all that took part in that atrocity, Sergeant Butler being the chief culprit. We continued on to the house of Oney Kane near Newport and found only his sister there, very badly shaken, for the raiding party of RIC had left their mark here too. They pelted him and beat him insensible. They retired to the rear of the house, probably considering shooting him. And when he escaped to the house of James Geraghty, who saw his condition, sent for the priest. And that priest was the Reverend Canon MacDonald, who was later to write, "It was an orgy of demons on the morning of the Lord's day. Their savagery was superlative." Was this the counter-terrorism measures envisaged by Lloyd George in 1920 in his, and I quote, "martial law of the most stringent kind"? In the midst of the strife and turmoil, there were the ordinary events that marked the lives of many of the participants. One of these was the marriage of the Connemara officer commanding, P.T. Joe MacDonald, to Michael Kilroy's sister.
We arrived at my father's house in Rossau, 1 mile from Newport on the shores of Clew Bay. We ate a huge breakfast and retired to bed and slept almost all day. The next few days were taken up with the preparations for the marriage of the OC P.T. MacDonald. The PP of Newport would not have the marriage ceremony carried out in Newport Church because it was too near the barracks. He arranged that the marriage would be carried out in Kilmina Church. The marriage was duly carried out at that church at 6 a.m. with nuptial mass.
Do you, Peter Joseph, take Matilda to be your lawfully wedded wife?
I do.
Do you, Matilda, take Peter Joseph to be your lawfully wedded husband?
I do.
I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride.
The bridegroom and best man were adorned with 45s and grenades. The wedding breakfast was partaken at my father's house in Rossau, and Mrs. MacDonald and our friends returned to Derrylahan, where her husband and I joined them later that night.
By early May 1921, the volunteers had plans in place to engage the enemy forces. Several ambushes were prepared at places such as the Yellow River and here at the Red Bridge in Burrishoole. The Tans failed to appear. The column were becoming impatient for action, and Kilroy knew that he would have to do something to draw them out. The column met at Ballinacurriga and Kilroy decided to send men to Westport and Newport to shoot up the town in an attempt to provoke the enemy into retaliation. The volunteers took up a position east of Kilroy's house, and 300 yards away on the Castlebar Road, Sergeant Butler walked out of the barracks. A single shot rang out and the sergeant fell, mortally wounded. At this point, all hell broke loose as the Tans bombarded the Kilroy home with fire, narrowly missing Michael's wife and other occupants of the house. The house was raided and set alight, as was the nearby foundry. Michael's brother John's shop in the town was raided and all goods destroyed. The rampage continued with burnings of homes and lootings of shops by the Tans. Headquartered at Ballinacurriga, Kilroy received information about happenings in Newport. Immediately he gathered the column together and headed for here, for Brocka. There the column set up communications posts and requested the services of the local company of volunteers. This was necessary, according to Michael Kilroy, in order to protect their means of retreat from their chosen ambush site at Kilmena. The men set off at early light. Kilroy was worried about the non-arrival of the men sent to Westport. 8 experienced riflemen, including Vice Commandant James Malone and Captain Johnny Duffy, Tommy Heavey, Jimmy Flaherty and Joe Ring. Likewise, those who had gone to Newport failed to return, for whatever reason. As the dawn chorus heralded the arrival of a clear May morning, the flying column arrived at Knocknabola. Kilroy began to position his men for the coming ambush. They settled down to wait. It would be a long wait. The morning dew would be long gone. The sun moved beyond its midday station before the sound of approaching lorries signalled the arrival of the RIC and the Black and Tans.
Take aim! Fire!
The volunteers failed to stop the first lorry. It continued through the ambush and stopped at school, some distance further on. The second lorry stopped at the priest's house and immediately began to engage with the volunteers. As the afternoon wore on, murderous volleys were exchanged, punctuated by the rattle of the Lewis machine gun. The occupants of the first lorry had by now returned and began to fire on the volunteers from the bridge. At this point, the volunteers began to take heavy casualties. By now, the flying column were under severe and mounting pressure. They were in danger of being outflanked from the north and the south by enemy forces. Kilroy realised that he had no choice but to withdraw from the engagement.
I ordered a general retreat and got Paddy Jordan to come out in the open and help me keep down the enemy while our boys were getting away. There was much blood on his face, but I thought it was from briar scratches and he did not complain to me. We remained there for about half an hour.
There was a dinner above in Father Conroy's house, I'd say around 2:30. We were nearly ready when suddenly the guns began. Everyone went to shelter at the walls, keeping back from the windows. I'd say after about 2 hours, a young policeman came to the house saying that the men were dying and that priests would have to attend to them. Michael Welch and myself said we were willing to go. We went out across the road and up on the hills. A sergeant of the police was with us, and we had to bend down every so often because the bullets were still coming. We went over a fence and found 2 volunteers dying. We were in time, thank God, to anoint them, but they died before our eyes. And may God have mercy on Thomas O'Donnell from Rossenrubble and John Stanton from Kilmena. I was told then that there was another man lying further on, and as I went to attend him, a tan put his gun to my chest, threatening me with death. He was shaking with fear, but when the sergeant saw him, he began to curse him and ordered him to pull back his gun. The poor man was McKevley, who was lying on the ground. I'd say he was already dead, but I anointed him anyway, and the grace of God to his soul. I was surprised they were all black in the face, but it must be the gunpowder, I suppose, was the reason for it. We left him there then and continued up the hill. There was 2 there. One of them is Jordan from Islanede, badly injured. He died 6 weeks after that. May his soul be at God's right hand. We left them all there and returned back to the house. But God, no one had any desire to stay in that place, so we went home.
By evening, quiet had returned to those green fields around Clooneen. No more could be done. There were wounded to be cared for, dead to be mourned, and other days to prepare for. What began as a planned engagement with enemy forces, and began in confidence, it must be said, ended in defeat and retreat. It is easier now with hindsight to weigh up what went wrong. No one in the active service unit could have anticipated Inspector Donnellan's tactic of separating the black and tan and RIC vehicles in the column. This allowed them to almost outflank the IRA and caused enormous problems for them. Michael Kilroy was missing 11 of his best men. These had gone to Westport and to Newport to cause provocation to the barracks there. They were also his best armed and best able. Kilroy must have pondered these events, and like all good generals, he learned valuable lessons. We remember those who died there. Captain Seamus McEvely of Castlebar, Tomás O'Donnell of Castlebar, Sean Collins of Westport. Paddy Jordan would be the last to die of his wounds a few weeks later. And we remember too those wounded and captured. Captain Paddy O'Malley of Newport, Thomas Nolan of Castlebar, and John Cannon of Westport. Dr. Madden and Nurse Lottie Joyce, with the help of Miss Gallagher, Bridget Kelly and Mary Mulcrone, tended the wounded. But time was pressing. The volunteers needed to get out of the area. It now fell to the local company to guide them across country to safety. They were a dejected and despondent group that left Gurtnaclasser and the surrounding villages and headed north towards the Navan Mountains and the village of Skirda, where they could expect to rest and recover. The men's expressions wore a mask of dejection and pain. Their faces were blackened by gun flash residue. Their varied uniforms were muddied and torn, and yet they held themselves proud, each one in his own private world, mourning the deaths of comrades lost in the heat of battle. Kilroy knew he would have a job to do to reinvigorate his men. Little did he know that the opportunity would arise sooner than he would expect. The darkness of night enveloped the men, giving them security for a time. This was a wild and desolate countryside, with only tracks and trails to guide the flying column along. They knew that in the morning at first light, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans would flood the countryside to seek them out. For the moment, the flying column was on the run. They made their way to Skirda Upper and Lower and the village of Clúnchafine, where they had a good rest on Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Advice was forthcoming to Kilroy that the column should perhaps take it easy until the harvest was gathered. Michael Kilroy was probably not that anxious to rest up. He wanted another opportunity to engage with the Crown forces. The volunteers wanted revenge for Kilmina. The column was billeted in 17 houses in all. Thomas Ketherick records that the column had 26 men in good fighting condition. He himself was billeted with a family named Lavelle. Early in the morning, shots rang out from an outpost, warning of an enemy approach. The RIC had been observed coming down the Tánahuagán road. This was, as Kilroy says, about 3:30 in the morning. The first response was to evacuate the wounded. This was done successfully by Ned Moan and others. They were guided through the valley of Glenlara to Shramore. At this point, some of the volunteers were taken to the Kirrian Caves by William Chambers. The rest of them, along with the wounded, ended up in Lahardán, where they were made most welcome and comfortable. For over half an hour, Michael Kilroy and Jack Connolly held off the police force of 24 men. Eventually, Dr. Madden found them, and he, along with Johnny Gibbons, John McDonough, Tom Kittrick and Paddy Cannon, remained to ensure the safe retreat of the wounded and the other volunteers. This is the ruin of Tom Chambers' house in Glenlara, and the 7 IRA men stopped here for food. And while eating, they noticed the approach of Black and Tans and RIC. They immediately retreated up this mountain, known locally as the Black Sods. In an unsuccessful attempt to rouse the IRA men from their cover, the Tans raked the hillside with machine gun fire. Eventually, the IRA men established themselves in a safe position on the hillside. They settled down to watch the enemy movements. However, Kilroy realised they would need to evade the ring of steel that would soon surround them. After dark, they returned to the village, something the police might not expect them to do. They called to McDonald's and Dyra's, where they had a good meal, and it was there they learned of the tragic death of Jim Brown. It was here that Jim Brown was shot, while trying to rejoin his comrades. He was a big, brave, quiet man, whose only weapon was a shotgun, and thus he needed to get close to his enemy to engage. This cost him his life. The Skerda actions were now almost over. The flying column had succeeded in engaging superior numbers, holding them at bay and making good their escape. Confidence was again high. The mettle of his men had been tested, and Kilroy was now certain of their courage and guile. Clady was the next stop for the flying column. It had joined the townland of Carrow Kennedy, and it was here that the West Mayo flying column would have their finest hour. On the 2nd of June, the column were advised that a force of Black and Tans were at Carrow Kennedy, where they were forcing local turf cutters to fill in trenches on the road. Michael Kilroy observed the goings-on and knew that should the patrol proceed, it would not get further than Erith Bridge, for the volunteers had already blown that bridge. The IRA men knew how many were in the patrol and what vehicles they had. Meanwhile, Michael Kilroy and his officers were laying out the trap. This time the planning and execution would be faultless. Great lessons had been learned from Kilmina and Skerda, and were now put into operation. Very quickly, the 50 or so flying column men were divided into attack units and suitably positioned using high ground. Within each group were designated officers whose job was to maintain morale in the face of fire from the enemy. Kilroy wanted no panic. Others were appointed to ensure that the machine guns carried on the lorries could not be brought into action with the effects they had had at Kilmina.
Here they come!
At around 6:30 in the evening, a scout reported the returning lorries. As the first lorry climbed the hill towards the ambush, the flying column were preparing to spring the trap. The driver was now in the sights of the marksman. D.I. Stevenson was driving the lead lorry, against orders it must be said. He was shot immediately and died instantly. His lorry stopped right there where the monument stands today. A furious gun battle followed. The men of the flying column sang in unison as they fired away at the enemy. The strains of Kelly the Boy from Killam rang clear across the valley. Michael Kilroy was to describe this in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History in 1955. There was a burst let up into the air to frighten us. This was the Lewis machine gun. The poor fellow tried to level it across the fence at us, but that was all. Suddenly, there was too much lead in his head. Another comrade pushed him aside and started the same game. The second man had scarcely caught the gun until he also was dead. Then a third man made like effort and met with the same fate. After that, the poor Lady Lewis was left all alone. After 2 hours fighting, it was decided to end the affair with a flanking movement, and that Joe Baker and some of his men would carry that out. Time was pressing, and there were still black and tans holding out in the widow McGrail's house. Jimmy Flaherty, who had possession of the Lewis gun, fired shots into the thatch. The tans immediately surrendered. Michael Kilroy arranged for a constable to cycle to Westport to seek medical and spiritual aid for the dying and wounded. No member of the active service unit was injured. 8 of the British side were killed outright or died of their wounds, and 16 surrendered. They were released as the column men left the area. The flying column disappeared away into the night. When the engagement ended around 8:30 in the evening and the remaining RIC and Black and Tans had surrendered, the IRA found that they had captured over 28 Lee Enfield rifles, 1 Lewis machine gun, boxes of grenades and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Kilroy and his men headed eastward towards Ahagaur, but this was a deception, and after 20 minutes they turned and headed west towards the village of Durlas in the remote mountainous area behind Crowpatrick. From the 3rd of June until the 11th of July, when the truce would become a reality, the flying column must avoid capture. Thus began an epic journey throughout the entire West Mayo Brigade area. Initially, the column made their way north from Carragh-Kennedy and through the Castlebar battalion area and on to Crimlin in the Burren. And from there, they made their way here to the Windy Gap. The French army had passed through here in 1798, and now the British army were out in force to capture this most troublesome flying column, who had caused so much mayhem and were so endeared to the ordinary people of Mayo. To avoid capture, the flying column continued from village to village and from safe house to safe house. On the 21st of June 1921, they arrived in the townland of Derrymartin on the southern slopes of Navan. And it was here that the iconic picture, The Men of the West, was taken. The remarkable thing about this picture is that the men have all removed their caps. This was necessary because the picture was taken at 15 minutes to midnight and required a long exposure to reveal all the detail. The men also had to remain perfectly still. Michael Kilroy remembers for up to 5 minutes. The photograph was taken by Jack Leonard of Crossmolina. A photographer by trade, Jack was also a member of the North Mayo Brigade. His pictures, taken before and after the War of Independence, provide a valuable visual resource for the period. Without doubt, this picture, The Men of the West, is regarded as the best photograph of an active service unit in the field. The column moved rapidly throughout the brigade area for a number of days, from Navan to the Windy Gap and on to Crimlin, circling back to Ahagaur. By Sunday the 24th of June, they realised there was a serious amount of enemy troops in the West Mayo Brigade area and that the hunt for them was hotting up. The column arrived here in Owenwee, and Kilroy decided they would dump arms and divide into small groups of 3 to 4 men carrying only sidearms. In spite of the fact that there were between 3,000 to 5,000 British troops in the brigade area seeking them out, they managed to evade capture and make their way to safety. Aranenu lá déag de Yule néideagus a fithehain, dos síniag an sus coga. Anish hí na hogli an fila walla dus na balse, na sráid baile agus a geantar féin. Bhí ar aitheintethe lena chlán. Bhí cogadh na saoirse thart. There were scenes of great joy and revelry in every house as the volunteers arrived home. The years that followed would see the fledgling state experience great change. But for now, it was men and women, like those of the West Mayo Brigade and Cumann Amon, who would take the flame of hope and with it light the fire of freedom.
She the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering. Oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering. She the Vahavan barley were bear grach to a vein, even the gooey draw, he shellig mirlog, is to jail to leshna gola. Oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering.
A gron you like thrill harsolya, ogly garma lemor, gor the gwaily jig ni gwil na spanig, is curishig ruig ar gaula.
Oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering.
Have we Larry no vert go vec and moramim bio in a year ach shachten gron you is me lagashki eg fogerch von gaula.
Oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering. Oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, oh, she the Vahawalya, and it's sure hooked on towering.